updates from the U.S. Department of Education. First, we'll hear from Deborah Spitz of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. And then we'll hear from Supreet Anand from the OELA, the Office of English Language Acquisition. So each of them have about 30 minutes. So each will have a presentation, and we'll open a few moments for question and answer. So if you have questions as they come, you are welcome to put them in the chat, and I will monitor those and kind of put them together at the end. Our speakers are also welcome to respond to them in the moment if they are able to keep track of the chat and present, which I'm really not able to do very well. So I will monitor the chat. So please put your questions there as folks have them. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Deborah Spitz, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides.
Hello. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, did that work? Yes, great. All right. So good afternoon. Good morning to some of you. I'm Deborah Spitz from the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. It's always a pleasure to present to the ELSCAS. Really appreciate you guys having me. And I'm just going to provide some updates. A lot of them are kind of our responses to questions we've gotten in the last few months since the last time I think we did one of these meetings. So I do want to really encourage questions in the chat, even if we can't answer them today. We do take them back to our team and tend to work them into our next presentation. So you know, and of course, we can always reach out to you directly if you have a more urgent question. So we do encourage, I really want to encourage questions for you to ask us, because we do really want to know, we know going into the next school year, it's going to be a very an interesting and challenging and unusual year. And so we're thinking a lot about, you know, what is and isn't going to be sort of, you know, normal about the coming school year. And so again, you know, do want to really encourage questions as you have them. I'm also going to just say, I apologize for any repetition. I presented on pretty much the same information last week to a WIDA meeting. And so I know that there's probably quite a bit of overlap. But it's not everybody. So unfortunately, some of you are going to hear this information twice. So, okay. So some of the topics I'm going to cover are briefly what's coming up with allocations and accountability and reporting, kind of a what's changing and what's not. We wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing questions that we've gotten relating to presumptive identification, which is something that came up a lot in the last year and a half because of COVID. Some things about annual ELP assessment, and want to focus some time. I see on your agenda later you have another session about using COVID funds. We're really just trying to provide as much information as possible on how states can use these COVID resources that they've gotten through the stimulus funds, and the importance of using those funds for English learners. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, you know, just provide you some links to resources. So allocations, those come out July 1. And so we are finalizing those now at the department. We are expecting to issue those final allocation amounts actually at the end of this week for most programs. But for Title III specifically, the preliminary totals that we did release in February actually are unchanged. Now, that's not true of other programs. It's only true of Title III. And that's because Title III allocation data comes from different sources than the other programs, and specifically from Census Bureau data and state data on the number of students assessed for English language proficiency. So just one thing to be aware of this year is, you won't see fluctuation between this year and last year because the number of, the number of ELP students assessed with an ELP did not change because we used older data for that because of COVID. You probably know that we did announce the availability of waivers for accountability in the 2020-21 school year. That actually doesn't impact reporting on any of the requirements associated with English learners and English language proficiency. So that's just in response to a question that we got from some states, and just want to share that actually all of the data that you typically collect for English learners would still be reported in the coming reporting cycle, which would be on the previous school year. And that is also true of English language proficiency assessments. Okay, so talking about presumptive identification, you probably are aware, so that's something we provided guidance on in May 2020 when when schools were closing. And it basically allowed states to adjust their identification procedures for students who couldn't be in school and take a full screener. So some screeners are online, but for many schools, they had to come up with alternate ways to screen students from home, including just using home language surveys, and then later going through more rigorous screening. So one thing that we've gotten questions about is we don't anticipate that presumptive identification will be needed in the coming school year because we think and we hope that students will be back in school. So we are not anticipating that schools will use those presumptive identification procedures. In other words, we are anticipating that states will return to their pre-COVID entrance procedures. And it is still important that states have statewide policies regarding entrance and identification procedures. But one of the things that's come up quite a bit for us in the last year and a half is, well, if a student was presumptively identified, we've said a number of times that they need to be treated the same as any other English learner, however they were identified, and that's in terms of services and in terms of receiving the annual ELP assessment. We did get some questions from some states about, well, what if the student is identified through a presumptive identification procedure, maybe they just got a home language survey, then at some point they take the English language proficiency assessment and they show as proficient. So at that point, are they then a former EL, or are they an EL that wasn't officially identified? And one of the things we actually, on the next slide, we say basically that it is kind of a case-by-case basis. We talked to our program attorneys about this quite a bit, and they think that it's really very much based on the circumstances of the student. There may be students where the identification was erroneous for some reason, and then you would call them erroneously identified. But there may be other students where they were identified at the beginning of the school year and they received a school year of services, and at the end of the school year, they received the ELP assessment and they were proficient. In that case, it seems to us that you would probably call them a former EL rather than, there's no reason to say they were erroneously identified. But again, we just want to encourage that that's a case-by-case decision. Where it makes a difference is in the issue of how a school monitors its former ELs. And so whether you, and how you report that student. So, but more importantly, how you monitor their progress. So, we want to encourage that monitoring of English learners once they become proficient. So that's where, whether you call them a student who wasn't an EL, meaning they were erroneously identified, versus a former EL, where that makes a little bit of a difference. Hopefully that's not super confusing. I'm very happy to answer more specific questions on that topic. On the English language proficiency assessment, that we did choose as a department to require states to administer the ELP assessment statewide in the spring of the 2020-21 school year. We did encourage quite a bit of flexibility in terms of extending testing windows and how states gave their assessments and when they gave them, which means that some of your states may have extended your testing window into the fall, which is fine. But we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the circumstances that might result in. Also, just a reminder on this slide too, that all English learners, including those with disabilities, must be provided the statewide ELP assessment with appropriate accommodations if needed, or an appropriate alternate ELP assessment for those students with the most significant cognitive disabilities consistent with their IEPs. You're aware of that, but we feel like this year in particular, it's important. We know it was challenging to assess all your English learners, and so we just want to emphasize that. So thinking about if you do have some students that did not, for whatever reason, you as a state, you gave your ELP assessment, maybe you're still giving your ELP assessment. We do realize that there are some students that may not have been able to come in for the assessment or receive the assessment. If students are assessed in the fall, it's important to just think about how you're going to, when you're going to get those results, how you're going to use them to make timely decisions about placement and how you're going to communicate those results to families. And we want to emphasize that, for purposes of exiting students from ELP status, we do still require the full ELP assessment of, a full, valid, reliable ELP assessment of all the 4 domains in order to exit students from EL status. That said, going into the fall, where again, we know that, it probably was difficult to assess all of your EL English learners, there may be students that will benefit from receiving a screener that might not have ordinarily received a screener, but that may be a benefit to some students, either because for whatever reason they couldn't get the ELP assessment, or a school is simply concerned about making sure that these kids get placed with the right services. So we just want to encourage the use of screeners where there's doubt. We know students have been out of the classroom for some time. And so, but again, that's for purposes of placement and services. And it's not for purposes of exit. States continue to have flexibility regarding their selection of ELP assessments, how they administer and when they administer those assessments. So states have always had flexibility of that, but we want to just reiterate that continues to be the case. So I talked a little bit about monitoring former ELs. And while this is a question we've answered a number of times, there's nothing new in the language on this slide. Essentially, the answer is that for any former EL, if there's a reason for a school or a teacher to think that the student is struggling because of a persistent language barrier, that former EL student can always be rescreened, and that should never be something that's prohibited. Here, where again, as I mentioned, where we know that there are students who are out of the classroom for a long time, there may be a number of former ELs that might benefit from from being rescreened, but at the same time, we don't want to create an assumption that that every student is coming back to school with a deficit. We don't believe that's the case either. So not assuming that any student needs to be rescreened, but definitely considering that might be the case. And when I talk about resources, this is the kind of thing where, well, okay, additional screening is requiring additional time and expense. And this is a perfect way to use some of those COVID funds that you have. So that leads into basically that topic, which is how you can use COVID-19 stimulus funds to support your English learners. And I have a lot of detail in these slides, but essentially when you're talking about either, and I'm talking about either CARES Act funds, there were SRSA funds, and then now there's the American Rescue Plan. Most of them are called ESSER, but there's ESSER, there's GEAR. So we have, there's so many acronyms for these different stimulus funds. Essentially though, what we want to emphasize is that they are very flexible and that they can and should be used for your English learners. And there's a lot of different ways you can use them. So essentially on this slide, we're talking about the American Rescue Plan funds. For the most part, the ARP and the GEAR and the SRSA, or the CARES and the SRSA funds are all pretty similar in terms of they can be used for many different purposes that would serve your English learners. So for the ARP funds, and I know states have just submitted plans for the use of those ESSER funds, but essentially those can be used to address lost instructional time and to ensure that to pay for interventions that respond to students' social, emotional, and academic needs, and importantly, addressing the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on subgroup populations, including English learners. So in the next paragraph, ARP ESSER funds can be used for actually any educational activity authorized under the ESEA, which includes Title III related services. One thing that's important is there is not a supplement not supplant requirement for ARP funds. There are two other requirements that I won't go into in detail, but they're detailed in a use of funds document that the department released a couple of weeks ago on using ESSER funds. So I'm not the ESSER fund expert, but there's something called, there's maintenance of effort, which you're familiar with. And then there's a new requirement called maintenance of equity. And I think that in my slides, I link to those FAQs, but if not, I'm certainly happy to share where those FAQs are. I can drop that into the chat. So my next few slides are mainly lots of examples, and this comes from those FAQs. Lots of examples of how you could use ARP, ESSER, GEAR, CARES Act funds to support your English learners. So certainly extended day or extended year activities, providing language accommodations, addressing the social and emotional learning needs of English learners, professional development for teachers to support English learners. Certainly any kind of professional learning on how to monitor the progress of English learners, technology to support learning, and hopefully personal protective equipment, that might not continue to be needed as much. But one thing that we have said in the last year and a half that these funds can be used for are things like clear face masks, because they're specific to instructing English learners. Now, if you were buying them for all of your teachers, that wouldn't be well, either way, because these aren't Title III funds. These are funds that can be used more broadly. So anyway, clear masks that facilitate language instruction if those are needed in the classroom. So those are some examples. Supporting family engagement of families of English learners in a variety of ways. Translation services, those are a few more examples. I talked a little bit about that there are not supplement, not supplant requirements, and that's important to be aware of. We do want you to be aware that where these funds are used for Title III related services, Title III, of course, does have a supplement, not supplant requirement. So if you've used any of the stimulus funds for services, and then you want to use Title III funds for those services, what you should be aware of is generally supplement, not supplant doesn't apply to funds that have gone away. So, once the stimulus funds are done, they're one-time funds. So you could use them for something and then later use Title III. We do want to caution you, though, that there may be situations where you use other funds, other state or local funds for something, then you switch to stimulus funds. And then there might be an issue with going to Title III funds in terms of supplanting. I don't have any idea yet if that's kind of a common scenario or not. So we wanted to raise the possibility just so you're thinking about it. That's the kind of thing where we would say, hey, come to us and talk to us about it. And that's it for me. I'm just going to share some resources, and Megan or Kathleen, will these slides be posted somewhere so that people can pull the links? Okay, great. So some of these you'll know about already, our program website, the National Clearinghouse on English Language Acquisition, the State Support Network, and then specifically a number of COVID resources are listed on this page. One thing I wanted to call your attention to is that in addition to the ESSER funds, we also have an ARP homeless program from the stimulus funds. That's something we're also rolling out this summer. And some of your English learners may, if they are experiencing homelessness, then they would benefit from this program as well. So these are some of the resources that we have on COVID. There are quite a number of others. And I did say I would pull the link for those FAQs because those just recently got released, and I will drop those in the chat. And then lastly, here's my information and our Title III mailbox. So we always encourage people to use the mailbox just because what that does is it gets you to our staff immediately. We check it every day. So rather than, you can certainly email me, but this mailbox is the best way to reach us. All right, and that's it for me. So I have not looked at the chat because I can't look at the chat and present at the same time. So I'll take a look now. But
there's one question. Thanks so
feel
much,
free to reach
Deborah.
out.
In the chat, it says, do we obtain parents' consent to re-entry or notify parent of the placement? I think that was asked back when thinking about rescreening students who had already been reclassified but may come back to school, and there may be a persistent language barrier to address.
Okay. I feel like I can't answer that on the spot. That's don't want to give an incorrect answer. So I'm happy to take that back. And Trisha, I can certainly reach out to you directly about that. And we could talk more.
Other folks have questions, you can raise your hand or post in the chat. So there's a question in the chat. Just to make sure I heard this correctly, if COVID funds are used for a Title III activity this year, and then Title III funds are used for that same activity next year, that would not be considered supplanting because the COVID funds are temporary.
Yes. And I'm just reading that as I. Yeah, so essentially the way supplanting works is there's a presumption that supplanting has occurred unless the funding source that came before it is no longer available. So I believe that means that once those funds are no longer available to you, then it would not be supplanting. And I just posted the link to the ESSER use of funds. That's a document we did just release a couple of weeks ago, and it's quite helpful. And we spent a lot of time actually thinking about special populations, that how they could be served. I mean, a lot of it is the slides I just presented, but it's a excellent reference document. So actually, so for the guidance presented in the PowerPoint, I think for most of it, I could direct you to, it's probably coming from different pieces of published guidance. So, and most of them I link to in my resources page, but like if they're Title III specific, they are probably in one of our FAQs or fact sheets, and I can always find that for you. Pretty much all of the COVID related guidance is either in that document that I just posted a link to, or it's in other fact sheets. So again, if you're looking for something in writing, I can probably find it. I think the one things that the area where we probably don't have something in writing is if it's really specific to like, well, going into this fall, how do we handle X? You probably are aware we're not super nimble when it comes to issuing guidance at the department. And we've kind of tried in the last year and a half, like, okay, how do we get this information out? And we've discovered that we get it out better through PowerPoints sometimes than through published guidance. So again, I think if you're looking for something in writing, please reach out and we can probably find a document for you. All right.
I just want to flag something that was brought up, and Deborah, you're aware of this, you and I emailed and corresponded about it, but I thought I would bring it up between your presentation and Supreet's, given that you both might have some insights on it or be able to do some further searching for us. So folks in the collaborative have had several questions about kind of CSPR data reporting, particularly as it pertains to Title III, but also given that's kind of more in our wheelhouse versus Title I, but really broadly. Because I think what we're finding in several sort of smaller conversations that there are various interpretations about how to report some of the program related information, as well as the teacher data that gets reported around, like how many qualified teachers are in Title III LIEP programs and some of those meanings around those. So you may not be able to answer the questions. I just kind of wanted to flag that as an ongoing sort of question that we have for US Ed. And we're not even sure, like Deborah, if you're the right entity to ask, or if it's Awella, or where all of that happens. And so I know Brenda had offered some guidance around that previously, but again, you may not be able to respond to that, but I just wanted to flag it as for the collective as something that we're kind of wondering about.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I know you did flag it as an issue, and I didn't present on it essentially because I can't at this point add a definition to something that's in CSPR that isn't already there, right? So so I do appreciate you flagging the question for me, because that helps us take, for the times that we are able to update guidance in CSPR, it's really helpful for us to know where the questions are. I think, in particular, the question of who is a certified teacher and what even are we asking about when we ask about certified teachers. I think it's really hard for us to define that at the federal level, just because it does differ so much locally. And so unfortunately, I think where CSPR doesn't have a definition for something, it does mean that it's a state determination. We do have another CSPR or an EdFax file specification where we talk about certification based on the certification that is needed for the person in the position they're in. And I don't know that that's helpful either. Again, that's going to be really locally determined. So we do know that there's probably, people have very different ideas of what that means. I will kind of keep that in mind I think we are, certainly you can always ask me or Supreet or, any kinds of questions like this. I think that probably my office is the right place to ask. It's just that I don't think, if it's not spelled out in CSPR, I can't add a definition to it.
Yeah, it's one of those where we wish we could use it at times to compare between states, but given that not every state, for example, has a requirement that teachers have that EL only teachers have an ESL certification, some states have that and some don't. So then how that question gets interpreted really, like you said, is really varied locally. So
Yeah.
yeah, there are a lot of layers to that, but thank you for thinking about it with us.
Sure.
Any last questions, comments for Deborah? Thanks so much for being here. We always enjoy our updates from USAID. Always really important reminders and new information for us as we implement the work. So you're welcome to stay, Deborah, as long as you'd like today. I want to turn it over now to Supreet Anand of OELA, Office of English Language Acquisition. And Supreet, do you want to share your slides or would you like Kate to?
That'd be great if you can do that, Kate. I don't trust myself with technology very much.
Sure.
It seems like this today keeps throwing me out. So if I disappear, it seems to reconnect me automatically too. I don't know what it's, maybe testing my persistence and perseverance on this. So if I disappear, I will reconnect immediately. So don't get alarmed. But hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. It is just such a pleasure. I was looking at everyone's profiles on, and it is just so nice to be with. This is my favorite group. So thank you for having me. We can go to the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about today is just, what OELA's priorities are going to be, just very, very general, and then just talk about the updates on research and publication. So in OELA's strategic objectives with this new administration are going to be focused around equity. President Biden has issued an executive order asking all agencies to address equity in our work. And in that executive order, which is number 13985, if you're a policy wonk like me, you like to know that, he has defined equity in two parts. Part one is how we treat others. So he talks about being consistent and systematically fair and just and impartial to all the individuals, including individuals who've been treated, who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment. So that's one part of the definition. And the second part of the definition focuses on access. So he talks about addressing the specific and proportionate needs of certain people and populations to attain, and access outcome and have good outcomes. It talks about, emphasizes the same or equal treatment of all persons, regardless of he talks about equity as providing proportionate access versus equal access regardless of what the needs are. So only assistance, and furthermore, it talks about that only advances equity should be counted towards this key issue. So taking that into account, on the next slide, OELA is going to be focusing on our agenda on promoting asset-based practices, promoting dual language development, monitoring ELs and special programs, elevating the teacher profession, and addressing the impact of COVID-19. But before we do that, we are attempting to define what equity will mean for us through our agenda. So we are developing an infographic, which should be out in a few weeks. We're almost done with the content of that. So we'll be, addressing the what we mean by equity, and then trying to address it through different things that we do. And interwoven in all of this, of course, would be the parent access and parent partnership component. And we are using the dual capacity framework to kind of, ground our work on that particular aspect of equity. So on the next slide, what I'm going to shift to is some of the work that we're doing and that we're going to be publishing upcoming. This pandemic has really afforded us the opportunity to connect with other offices within the department and really look at what they're doing and how we can partner on certain aspects of their work. So one of the things that we're doing is collaborating with IES on their new research and development centers. And these are the links to those websites on those centers. And I would encourage you to take a look at these. There's some great resources, some practice briefs, some webinars that we've done in collaboration with them. And this is just the start. This is something that we're going to continue to do, and you'll be seeing a lot more coming from us through these centers. And we've ongoing meetings to continue our work with them. Next, another aspect of our collaboration with IES has been to the American Institute of Research, AIR. And one of the studies that I want to bring to your attention that is very, very recent in publication has been this particular one on reading or understanding the reading trajectories of students at the lower grades in kindergarten, first and second grade. So on the next slide, I just want to share some key points from this study. So this study analyzed data from early childhood longitudinal study, which was the ECLS through K, that's early childhood through K 2011. And they analyzed the 2015 grade 4 NAEP reading assessment to look at the outcomes. And what they looked at was, what factors are associated with early reading achievement. They looked at, are there any distinct growth patterns that you can see? How do these development patterns progress? Any distinct reading skill profiles associated with these? And what are the skill profiles of students who perform below basic on NAEP and each of these data collection points? So it's a very, very important study that I want to bring to your attention. And some of the key highlights, if you go to the next slide, you can see that what they found were 5 distinct patterns of growth from the fall of kindergarten, that's the start of kindergarten, to spring of grade 3. And what I like about this study is that they look at all the students in those grades with a specific focus of where English learners, students fall in these patterns. So if you look at these patterns, you see the red line on top, which are the high performance. This is about % of the students, and their growth, they start at a higher point than their peers, and they continue to maintain that growth trajectory above average than their peers. The blue line that you see is the average learners. So this group is about 52% of the students, and it's the reference point for the other groups. The green line that you see there are what they're calling the early boosters. Although they start out performing slightly higher than the average at the fall of kindergarten, they're still above average performance group, and they make very strong growth in their first 2 years. And by the end of grade 1, they're very close to the high performing group. And this includes about 20% of the student sample. The purple line represents the steady but the slow learners who start out very close to the average performing group. They maintain a slow growth pattern, but also, if you look at it carefully, results in a kind of a widening gap below the average. And then the last one, the orange line, are the struggling learner groups. And these start out performance level of all the groups. And although they do make growth with the skills that they are assessed, but it is not enough of a growth to put them on a trajectory that is going to help them catch up with the average student performance group. So the critical finding in this study was that ELs, English learners, and this is kindergarten, remember, English learners are overrepresented in the struggling readers, the orange line, and in the steady but slow, the purple line. So that is a bit of a concern that, that's where our ELs are, most represented. What they also found was in the parent-reported variables. So in the high performer or the early booster group, the parents reported that students outside of school read more, read books on their own, and they visited the library more frequently. And in the teacher-reported instructional practices, in contrast, the teachers reported that in the high perform that the struggling readers, they focused more on new vocabulary, dictating stories, and they taught skills related to both foundational reading and comprehensive strategies. So we learned that the English learners that are in the struggling readers group spend less time outside of school on visiting the library or reading books on their own. And even when they were with their teachers, a lot of the time that the teachers, the kinds of activities that the teachers did with them were about learning new vocabulary and basically lower level reading skills. And so I think it's something that we need to kind of look at a little bit more carefully in terms of how are we teaching reading skills to our English learners at the elementary grade. Because what we found through the study was that even though the teachers instinctively were going towards interventions that were geared towards low performers, it wasn't helping our students actually catch up with their peers. So we really need to rethink that strategy a little bit. On the next slide, what we also found was that when we looked at the skill profiles, that mastery of the alphabetic principle and phonemic awareness by the end of grade 1 was critical, and that comprehension and sight words in grades K and 1 were very, very important. And in my conversations with some of the reading specialists, when I talked to them, one of the aha moments in that group that I talked to was that a lot of the sight word recognition strategies or the phonemic strategies that were being used by reading specialists were normed on native speaking kids. And when you take those strategies and apply them to non-native, obviously it doesn't work. But those are the strategies that most of our reading experts are comfortable with, that they're using, that they're teaching. And so you see where our kids then are not making the gains that they could. So I just wanted to kind of put that on your radar as something to think about in your workshops, in your trainings with EL specialists or with the reading specialists, to look at carefully at to what sort of strategies are being used. On the next slide. So basically, what can we do about this? One is, of course, high quality pre-kindergarten, kindergarten ready when they come to school is important. And of course, identifying students for additional support, and that should occur as early as possible with an assessment of all reading subskills and with frequent monitoring of growth in their initial performance is very, very important. Because otherwise, by the time we get to second grade, third grade, our kids are already way behind in their reading skills. As we saw on those trajectories, only 20% of our kids really are making it through. Next slide. So shifting gears, I think, yeah. So we can go to the next slide. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. What I wanted to also just talk about is, we have the continuity of learning operations page that is still up and learning. We are continuing to add to it, continuing to add more resources, and that is, hopefully you find it useful. Please continue to give us feedback and continue to add to that page. If you have resources that we can continue to use. So if you'd like to submit a resource or you want to add something to the web page, please feel free to do that. Next, in addition to the learning page, these are some of the resources that have been submitted by or from the department. And I also added, or I sent out, I hope it is on the membership hub. If not, we can add it, that the Office of Civil Rights, OCR, has just released another document on the effect of the pandemic on our underserved communities, which include English learners. And as I've said earlier, that we're going to find this administration, the resources that come out are much more inclusive of all of our different communities. And so you'll find that in this new document that OCR has published after the pandemic, that there are a lot of good information on how it has impacted our English learner communities and other underserved communities. And while the information is probably not new for you, you live that every day. But I think what the document can help you do is frame your conversations with others in the community or your peers on how to kind of talk about the impact on our English learners and why we need the resources to counter that. On the next one, we wanted to just mention, we're going to continue to provide new fact sheets. Some of our newer ones have been on English learners with disabilities, English learners in different local districts, our highest numbers in different local districts, our English learners with gifted and talented, and so on and so forth. If you have any additional ideas for any fact sheets that you think that we should add to our list, please let me know. We'll be more than happy to look into it and see how we can continue to, provide this information through our data sources that we have. On the next website, I wanted to just talk about our new publication. We've have our biennial report out. The next one will be coming out soon. But I also wanted to talk about integrating math while teaching mathematics, integrating language while teaching mathematics. This is a new brief, and this is, just been recently published. I hope that it is useful to you. We are also publishing our brief, have published our brief on early childhood education, all going in line with our agenda on equity and our information that we want to send out. On the next slide, we want to talk about, we can move to the next slide. We want to talk about our infographics. We published our infographic on English learners who are Black. Our next infographic is going to be on, of course, defining equity. And then we will look at perhaps an infographic that profiles English learners through different programs. So English learners that are, accessing Title I, Title II, etc. So those are some of the ones that we have in mind right now. On our next page, I wanted to just talk about some upcoming events. We just published this brief, and we'll be doing a webinar that goes with it. The two experts that helped write this brief will be talking about how to incorporate language, but also examples of different types of activities and strategies that you can do. Please do let your math specialists in your districts know, so that we can get more participation from the local districts and from your content specialists at the state. So we're trying to broaden our pool of people that we reach out to, our stakeholder groups, and we're trying to see how we can reach out to our content experts and our local district people to kind of spread the information about our English learners. On the next one, I wanted to just put on your radar that the department is going to be doing a series of sessions on equity. It's called the Educational Equity Summit. The first one is on June 22nd. I've added the link for you. This will feature a discussion on how students can access a high quality education and how we can respond to their needs, and how all students, how all schools can create a more culturally and linguistically inclusive learning environment. We're very excited that this is through the Department of Education, not just OELA. So different offices have been working on this summit and on these different documents. So we're very thrilled to see that level of collaboration across our department. And we hope that helps model what we'd like to see happening at the state level and at the local district level when it comes to English learners. And then last, of course, I always leave you with, please connect with us through all of these different sources. We're also on Pinterest now, and of course, Facebook and our Nexus newsletter being our main avenues. Please do spread the word about our newsletter to your peers so that we can make sure that we are providing as many people as possible with updated information. So with that, I am going to stop my presentation and see if there are any questions. Let me look at the chat.
Thanks so much, Supreet. A quick one. Who is invited to attend the June 22nd Summit on Educational Equity?
It's open to the public. It is open to the public. So we will, happy to have you there.
Supreet, it strikes me that a lot of several of the resources that you shared could be useful for state leaders in terms of thinking about what sound theory and research says about serving English learners, and that they could be tools that folks use to perhaps go to a webinar together with other folks in their state department or with local ed leaders and have a conversation about that. I'm trying to connect this back to the three prongs of Castañeda. Do you see other ways, do you have other ways in which you might envision some of the OELA resources being used and taken up by folks?
So we try to target a variety of audience through our different types of resources. So depending on the audience, some of them are just purely informational. Some of them are building our own capacity to know more so that we can be more informed and helpful, to our peers. And I think using them for different purposes, using them as a way to have those conversations with others at the state and local level is certainly, I think, the most productive way to use our resources. And then also using them to help you frame your conversations. Because, when I look at all of you, what I see are, collectively an audience of advocates for English learners. We advocate for them through different ways that we do our work. And so sometimes we need, at least, I know I do sometimes, I look for, okay, I've got to have this conversation. How do I frame this? What is the right thing to say? What data can I use to support this conversation? How do I get my win? And so we hope that the resources we provide help you with that. And, like I've said before, we are here to support you. So if there is any different way that you want us to present this information, or if you just need a sounding board, please feel free to connect with us and we'll be happy to support you in all of those ways. But yeah, definitely the conversations is our key, and we hope to work with you to, improve that piece on what we do. Everybody's super quiet today. I've never seen this group so quiet. I think is it Zoom.
Yeah, you're welcome to unmute to ask a question or put it in
Can
the
I ask
chat.
a question? Actually, it's the
Yeah.
data question, Sabri. Thank you for this great presentation. On the NAEP patterns that you were showing, how do you interpret the magnitude of the differences between them? I mean, do you have a sense in terms of standard deviation units or whatever in terms of the gap and how much the gap reduction, especially in that accelerating group, how much they're making up, and setting a standard for kind of how to judge.
So-
We want the yellow dotted kids in the yellow dotted line to really increase, and so can you help us understand that a little bit better?
So what they were not doing was actually providing any interventions. This is observational data. So what they were looking at is happening in the classroom, and then at specific points of the year. So whether it, as you can see at the bottom, so in fall, spring, the first
Mhm.
and so on. So at those particular points, they looked at the assessments that, the average of their performance.
Mhm.
And they used that to, pull together the trend lines. So it's longitudinal data that they were looking. I'm not sure whether it was standard deviation or
Mhm.
just a difference in the scale score point average. I don't remember from the top of my head,
Mhm.
but it's how the kids fell into these categories and the percentage of kids that fell into these categories and how they followed those kids, started out, at a 83 percentage point, like what was their scale points, what was their trajectory versus kids that fell into each of these categories. So they kind of categorized the kids from their starting points to look at where they fell. And then they kind of, based on the categories of students, they look at how many percentage points of students fell into each category. So
Right.
so the good part was a majority of the kids were on that average line, but most of our children were in the bottom group. And so, yeah. And so our takeaway from that was what we're doing right now in the elementary grades in terms of the interventions is not working very well. And in a follow-up conversation with the researcher, the experts, reading experts, that was one thing we found was many of them were just using the standard types of reading skill strategies that were mostly normed on native speakers, et cetera. So just we felt like there's a lot of work to be done here.
Yeah, and it looks like it's skewed, right? So that the tail is really long on the low side.
Right.
That 83 at the for the yellow line is quite a bit more distant from the average, the
Yes.
blue dotted line, than the blue dotted line is from the red dotted line.
What we don't have in this one was the kindergartner readiness scores
Mhm.
to see, where the tail end, where that disparity was coming from or that distance was coming from. Our assumption is children in that 83 that start out at the red line are children who have been to really good preschools or are coming from homes where there is a lot of literacy. So they're already doing those types of practices that parents reported. My child goes to the library very often, those kind of things. So.
Thank you.
And there's a question in the chat. Did this research include promising practices and instruction for young English learners or multilingual learners specifically, given that it's kind of difficult to find research that.
That is so true, that it is very difficult to find that kind of research. And that's why having these type of publications really helps us figure out where the gaps are in research. So we see that there is a gap here. And that's, something for IES to kind of look at and see how we can help with that. And we're going to go back to publication on early childhood education and see how we can bolster, some of the information there.
Yeah, so there's some discussion in the chat around how research as well as MTSS systems that use assessments are not often normed on English learners. And so it's often kind of hard to figure out the best supports.
Yep, I remember when Dibbles was all the rage. I used to say, my kids got Dibble today because it was so not helpful at all.
Arbitrary, if you will.
Arbitrary.
I was a first grade teacher and had to do that with my students as well. Thanks so much, Supreet, for being here today. We've really spent the morning kind of, again, grounding our work in what's going on in the policy world and thinking about resources that OEL is producing to try to inform your all's work in this space. Deborah alluded to several uses of funds that perhaps could be used to leverage some of those best practices and high quality instructional components that are outlined in Supreet's resources from OEL. So after the break, we will have a session specifically on using funding generally, but specifically relief funds to support long-term improvements in English learner education. So we'll see you all back here. The room will open at 11:30, yes, Pacific, 2:30 Eastern, and we'll start at 5 minutes after that. So we look forward to seeing you then. I hope you have a great break. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone. My pleasure.